How's it going, everyone? This is another Security Unfiltered podcast episode where today we actually talk with Mick Leach from Abnormal Security. Abnormal Security actually sponsored this podcast. And again, just to remind you guys, they didn't determine any questions that I can ask them or anything like that. They just believe in what we're doing here at the podcast and they wanted to support the podcast. And so that's how it all kind of happened, right? So, with that, let's go ahead and dive into the episode. I think you guys are going to love it. All right. See you guys. How's it going, Mick? It's really good to finally have you on the podcast. I think this one we actually put together pretty quick. Most of my guests, it takes about like 6 months to come on. Honestly, like it's my backlog is insane, but we were able to put this thing together pretty quick, and I really appreciate that.
Certainly. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Joe. I really appreciate it. It's great to be on the podcast.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Mick, before we dive into, abnormal security and everything, why don't you tell my audience, your background, right? How you got into IT, maybe why you got into IT. The reason why I have all my guests start there is because, everyone's coming at this from a different background. They're all coming at it from, different skill sets and whatnot. And if I feel like if they can hear, a matching background, a matching skill set, they can then know like, hey, this thing is possible, right? Like I didn't know that this was possible at the time, but now I think I can actually do it. So what's your background with it?
Yeah, well, hopefully my story is a little bit inspiring in that case, because I did take sort of the scenic route to cybersecurity. I joined the military, was in the Army, the U.S. Army, go Cav Scouts. So if you're familiar with that, was a Cav Scout for 8.5 years with the U.S. Army. And as I was getting ready to get out, it became time to start figuring out what next looks like, and had been interested in computers for a long time. Really enjoyed working on them. Had been in my unit. I was early on the only guy that knew how to type. I'd taken a typing class in high school. I failed that class, by the way. Was terrible at it, but still was the only guy that knew where the keys roughly were, and got suckered into typing all kinds of non-commissioned officer evaluation reports, these kinds of things. And so suddenly I became known as the computer guy in a combat arms unit. So it was a little unusual there. So I get out and ended up having an opportunity right away to work with Linux. And so I was supporting custom-based Linux applications, a small telecommunications company. And did that for about 4 years before an opportunity to join Nationwide Insurance came along as a system administrator there, and did a variety of different system administration things, really getting into encryption, decryption of data in motion. So whether it was PGP, SFTP, FTPS, really encrypting and protecting data in motion. And that was kind of my first foray into cybersecurity. So fast forward to about 2012, and they were looking to start creating a security operations organization. And I was given the opportunity to join that group from the ground level, and was jumped at that chance and realized this is what I was made for. Being able to protect with ones and zeros digitally felt so in line with my background in the military. And it really just felt like this convergence of everything I had been doing and loving for the last, basically my whole life. And so I jumped at that chance. Of course, Nationwide at that time experienced a relatively public breach. What that meant, though, for me was that, and it happened to be my first week on call, as these things go. What that meant, though, was they opened the wallet and said, how do we fix this? We hired a lot of consultants that came in and helped us build an elaborate security operations center, becoming larger than that, a security command center. And I was one of the founding members of that. So learned a great deal about building and running security operations centers. Had the opportunity to move from there after that was reached a steady state to a company called Alliance Data, and did much the same thing for them, building and optimizing a security operations center there. Did that for about 4 years. And then knew that my next role, I wanted to make an impact at a higher level, right? I wanted to move the needle on the industry. Protecting one company is valuable work, right? That's honorable work. But I wanted to be able to make that impact broader. And so that's when I knew the next move would probably be with a vendor. And I had bought and used Abnormal Security at my last company for about a year and loved it, and added them to the list of companies that I would love to work for. And sure enough, an opportunity came available. So I've been here. I was security hire number 2 at Abnormal Security.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so my CISO, Mike Britton, is an old friend of mine. And so getting to come in and build from scratch, really put your finger on, your fingerprint on something from the beginning was such a great opportunity. So did that for about the last 2 years, and have just recently, about 2 weeks ago, moved into a field CISO role where I get opportunities to talk with folks like you.
So, I have a lot of questions about that journey. So when you started out with Linux,
Mm-hmm.
What was that like? Because Linux is unlike anything else, really. And I assume, you're talking about the terminal side of Linux, not the fancy GUI side, that everyone is used to. What was your experience with that? What was the ramp up like with that? Because I actually started my career with Linux, and I mean, it's like drinking from the fire hose on steroids. It's like, wait a minute, the network stack works like this, and I'm just getting out of college. I'm like, wait, I just learned how to spell IT. Like, what are we talking about here?
Yeah. No, it's funny you say that. I couldn't have put it better, right? Drinking from a fire hose on steroids. That's absolutely what it felt like. I will tell you that on the tail end of my military career, as I knew I was getting out, I had the opportunity to go to a Solaris course. So they sent me to a Solaris course, and I'll never forget. I felt like the biggest bonehead in the room because, I was half paying attention, thinking about when's lunch, and suddenly it was time for an exercise. And the first step was to install Solaris. And so we're working on that, and I've got the CD in, and I could not, for the life of me, I'm hitting the eject button, could not figure out how to get the CD out to change CDs to the next run. And I couldn't figure it out. I felt like a moron. And so I was like, sorry, I'm going to have to raise my hand and just ask, how do you get it to eject? And he's like, type eject. I was like, no, like really? And he's like, seriously. So that was the first time that I remembered thinking, oh, this is very different, than the Windows world that I had been raised in. At the same time as we started to get into the tech stack and we started to see how the disk was partitioned and data was stored, and you had so much more granular access to where you were putting things on disk and the ability to go and see things directly on the disk. I was like, man, this is fantastic. You don't have any of this with Microsoft. And so that's how I kind of got into it, learned just enough to convince somebody to hire me, which was probably a mistake initially, but they gave me a chance, and I wanted to prove them right. So did that. That was 21st century communication. So got in there, and they were very patient and allowed me to make a lot of mistakes and learn a few things the hard way and a lot of things the easy way, thankfully.
Yeah, it's it's crazy when you go from something like Windows that's very user friendly, and then you go to Linux and you have to, like you said, you didn't know how to eject the disk. Like on Windows, you hit the button. You don't type eject or anything like that. You're not clicking anything. You hit the button. You assume it's going to work. But in Linux, none of those features and functionalities tie together.
No.
Right? You have to actually create the tie. If you want that button to eject, you need to write the script that says eject when this is pushed.
Yeah.
You know, like that's what it is. And, you know, same thing with, you know, like partitioning a disk. I mean, oh my God. And I tried to do encryption at one point on Linux. I mean, my brain was melted. I actually needed my VP to come over because he was the only person at the company that knew how to do the encryption. And I mean, I had to have him just come over and just type. And I just took notes on the side. Just like my brain was melted after like 2 hours of that, troubleshooting it, not knowing, you know, what the hell is going on, not looking at the right log files. Like I was just having a terrible time.
Yeah, no, I agree. And so the good news was, right, learning with Linux early on, especially with like old school Solaris, and then moving to like Red Hat is something a little better supported. You know, you learned a lot of things the hard way, sort of the old school way. And while there are far more, you know, newfangled ways of doing things, you know, said knock can get you pretty far. So I still kind of lean on those things from time to time. But yeah, learning from the beginning was great.
Do you ever work with Linux at all, like on the side even? You know, I find it that, you know, I can't stay away from it, honestly. You know, I still have a VM that's forever, you know, installed with a Linux flavor that I like, that I prefer. Which embarrassingly, it's Ubuntu because I like the ability to have that GUI and also be able to do things in the terminal and feel like I'm getting things done. But I use that for very like select things, you know, within my home network.
Sure. Yeah, no, I absolutely. It's still, it's like an old pair of comfortable shoes, right? It's still the most natural, most comfortable thing. So I still do, just like you in my home lab, have a couple of VMs of Linux. I've got a couple of Ubuntu versions. I've got, of course, you can't be a security guy without having at least one instance of Kali running all the time. ADHD, which I really like, Active Defense Harbinger distribution, really good there. So yeah, just a few different Security Onion. You know, you've got to have a few different versions running in the background, but it's still the most comfortable for me, especially if I'm going to get into log analysis. Just nothing beats a great grep sedawk, you know, ability to parse tons of data.
Yeah, absolutely. Once I learned that, it was like having a superpower in Linux.
Yeah.
It's like, wait a minute, I don't have to sift through this log and search for things and all that, you know? Yeah. So when you started at Nationwide, you said the first week they got breached.
So it was the first week of my move into security. So I moved into a security focused role. It was the first week that I was on call. And I remember joining the call and thinking, wow, this is an exciting call. And then it got very exciting. And I realized I'm in over my head. And so we had to, I had to call in for some help. But that being at the very front end of that, and then actually seeing a large company work through a pretty large scale breach, that made an indelible impression on me, because it taught me so much about security, the legal side of things, you know, the way we protect information, the way we share information, all right at the very beginning. So it was like a crash course, and you know, you can't pay for that kind of experience.
Did they already have a security team stood up?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So a lot of those, and that's what, as we brought consultants in, that's what we learned, is that a lot of the right things were in place. You know, it wasn't a lack of skills. It wasn't a lack of people, a lack of tooling. What it really was a lack of coordination. So we had a lot of disparate tooling, a lot of disparate capabilities spread across a very large organization. And what we learned is that we needed to better unite those capabilities under one house, right? Under one floor, so that we could better communicate with one another. And that made a world of difference. You know, there were like any large organization, there were, you know, territorial things where you're like, oh, well, that's my world. You got to stay out of you got to stay out of that area. That's mine. And this is our world. And no, we don't touch servers. We only work in, you know, endpoints. And, you know, so we had to break down some of those walls, deal with some of those sort of past sins and then figure out how to better collaborate going forward.
Yeah, you mentioned, the checkbook opened up, which, for a security person, that's like what you've been waiting for. And I went into a credit bureau right after a breach at one of our competitors, and I mean, it was anything you want.
Sure.
Like, name your number. It literally doesn't matter. We have a blank check from the CEO saying that we can do this. Apparently my manager, this is a couple weeks before I got there, apparently my manager actually, was at the bar across the street with a bunch of the team, and he was drinking a beer, and he said, "You know what? F it. We're going to deploy this thing. We're going to buy these tools. Like, screw it. The company is just going to figure it out." And I mean, like, that was, for the company, that was the best decision because we desperately needed that technology in place. But for the team around him, it was miserable because not only were we trying to ensure that we wouldn't get breached like our competitor, but now we're, trying to deploy these tools at the quickest pace that these vendors had ever seen. I talked with the vendor that I was in charge of their solution, and I asked them, what's the quickest deployment you've ever seen with this solution at any other customer? And he said, "Oh, well, I'd have to, ask around and get back to you." Right? They said the quickest full deployment was 18 months. I said, "Okay, what did we do it in?" He goes, "You did it in 6 weeks."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Oh, I guess that was a little quick."
Yeah. And I actually had a similar experience, right, coming here to Abnormal Security, where we were able to buy and build things very quickly, which was for me a whole new world because in a massive Fortune 500, Fortune 100 company, things move slowly and there's lots of red tape. And so, to deploy a new SIM would take 18 to 24 months. Here it took, 3 weeks because everybody's pulling in the same direction. It was a massive difference. So that's exciting. I will say part of the problem with the blank check, though, was that because, the CEO, CFO, they all come down and say, "Okay, just tell me how much to write this check for so that we never have this happen again." And that's where you have to have a hard conversation and say, "Guys, it's not how it works." Right? We can build a lot of defenses. We can better protect ourselves. We can certainly lessen both the likelihood and the impact of a compromise going forward. But to say it'll never happen again, that's not something that we can do. So what we'll do is better position ourselves to lower the likelihood of it happening again. But in the event that it does, and it likely will at some point, but in the event that it does, we'll lower that impact as well. So that's the key. That's what we're trying to do. And it took a minute to kind of rescope people's mentality on this.
Yeah, that's interesting because I feel like, executives at that level, they're not used to not being able to throw money at a problem and have that problem be fully resolved. That's always kind of the question and the approach that's taken. But with security, it's like, yeah, we could throw $20-30 million into this thing. We could have the best tech stack, the best, engineers in the country working on this thing, and we could still get breached by something that, we didn't even know existed. Because that's what a 0-day is. They could literally just use a 0-day on us and get around everything that we just did, and I feel like it's also really important what you did there is, explain it that way, because a lot of security teams would just take that money and, like run for the hills basically. And that's maybe the worst case, because what if you take all that money, you deploy all these tools, do all that work, you get the increased headcount, and then you get breached? well, now your job is at risk because you didn't properly kind of prepare them, for that reality. And so now it looks like you're incompetent when in all actuality, you're not incompetent. It's just how it works in security.
Yeah, absolutely. It takes a while to change the mindset, right? That's the key thing, I think.
Yeah, that mindset is the hardest thing I feel to change. Right now, I work at a pretty large company. And when you said, it's going to take 18, 24 months to deploy this SIM, it took me like 12 months to get through a POC. Sure. of a far smaller solution than a SIM. It's like embarrassingly slow. Like, guys, I would have had this done in 3 weeks. Like, come on, just let me do some work.
Yeah. No, I'm with you. Yeah, and the other thing in terms of avoiding future compromises is that no matter how good your tech stack is, right? Bad guys are always coming up with new and exciting ways of circumventing them. So, you look at some recent breaches that we've seen hit the news. They're not even targeting technical things anymore. They don't even use a 0-day often. It's not nearly that complex or technical. They just pick up the phone and call the help desk, right? It's more social engineering that we're starting to see these days, right? Because people are easier to hack than systems. It's just that simple.
Well, wasn't that the case with LastPass, the LastPass breach, where they called up support and the support guy had enough access, and they just sent him a link, and he clicked on it like he normally would, and it completely compromised LastPass as a whole.
Yeah. Or you look at some of the recent things happening in the desert, right, in Vegas, where they just picked up the phone, called the help desk, purported to be, a high-level security engineer, and they reset his password, they reset his MFA for him, and suddenly you've given the keys to the kingdom to a bad actor, right? It wasn't enough. They just reset his creds, but they also reset the MFA token so that he could get directly in the right way, right? He didn't have to circumvent anything. There was no link. There was no malicious activity of any kind apart from social engineering. And that's really what we're starting to see these days.
Yeah, it's really interesting you bring that up. When earlier on in my career, I did a lot of work with the government, and there was a slew of documentation and background checks that I had to do, and I didn't even have a TS, right? Like I didn't even have top secret. I didn't even have secret. I couldn't touch a keyboard, and I still had to fill out like a 80-page document about, every place that I've been since I was born, who I spoke to.
Done it.
Yeah, all that stuff, and one of the things in there, like a part of my training, I guess, I was talking to my handler, and we got into this conversation. It was pretty late at night, so I don't remember quite exactly what it was, but we were discussing about how people get compromised, and he said, from his own experience, right? He had a sick kid with cancer. His credit card bills were very high, and he was waiting on a tax return to actually pay off the credit cards because, he's in government. He has a clearance. He has to make sure that it's low. But it wasn't anything that he did, like he wasn't buying cars. He was buying medicine for his kid.
Right.
And so the agency knew about it. They were very understanding of it. But he said that, enemies will look at that and say, oh, we could cut him a check for, a small amount of money, 20 grand, and it'll alleviate that debt. And we'll do that just for a name, right? He doesn't have to tell us anything else. We'll just do it for a name. Mm-hmm. They make it sound very small, very minute. Like, what would you ever do with a first and a last name? Like, I'm not even giving you the title, like nothing like that. And, that's a good point, right? Like, I don't know if something like that took place, but like these people out there, that don't like America or don't like your company or whatever it might be, they will literally, pay you tens of thousands of dollars just for a name. I mean, that's an absurd topic to me, right? To go down, because to me, that means nothing. And that's such a minute thing. I would never personally, if I was ever confronted with that situation, I mean, now obviously, I wouldn't make that choice because now I have that knowledge. But beforehand, I would never second guess it. You want to give me how much for a name? Dude, I'll give you the roster. Like, that's where my mind would be. Like,
Sure. Yeah, and the thing is, and while that definitely happens, right? I mean, when I was in the military, that was definitely something that we talked a lot about, is reporting those kinds of things. We're well trained to expect and report those kinds of interactions, regardless of how innocuous they seem. You look at Tesla a few years ago. There was an external threat actor that offered a Tesla engineer significant money to just simply introduce a single file of malware and let them. They would take it from there, and it was. And he thankfully reported it, so it didn't become an issue. But more what we're seeing, at least in my experience, is bad actors that are preying on the good nature of human beings. As security people, we don't trust anybody, right? I suspect everything. I'm paranoid. That's just, that's how we are built. However, like Marcy over in finance isn't built that way, right? They're just people in service roles. Their job is to help people. If you work in finance, your job is to pay bills. If you work in HR, your job is to help people solve problems. And so when someone comes to you needing a bill paid or needing a problem solved, they don't typically look very deeply into those things. They just don't suspect, bad motives. And so they respond to that call for help, right? I've talked to an FBI psychologist before who talked about the power that comes with the request for help, right? I need your help. Those 4 simple words, right? I need your help. Those are powerful words. And they can elicit people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do or that they might be more suspicious of. But because they feel like they're helping someone, they'll do more, they'll go further and not be suspicious, not think they're doing anything wrong, and yet be the source of the compromise.
Yeah, that's a really good point that you mentioned. Security professionals are some of the most paranoid people that I know. And I feel like calling it paranoid is not doing it justice, but you get what I'm saying. I'm sure all of our listeners, understand that, which, brings up a good point. Currently at my current role, right, we POC'd a bunch of different WAF solutions, chose one of them. And my first response was, hey, I want to stand up a Kali Linux box and I want to pound this thing when we deploy it, right? As it's going live, as we're creating the rules, I want to make sure these rules that they claim is working, I want to make sure that they're actually working. And almost everyone in the room was like, you think that they wouldn't, already know that this is working when they're deploying it? Like, we have the vendor that created it deploying it for us. I'm like, yeah, that doesn't matter to me. Right. If we're spending this amount of money, we need to know definitively it's working. Like, not know, oh yeah, I'm sure it is, I configured it right. Like, no, I ran into configuration issues in the POC for a reason, like, I configured it to the best of my knowledge and it wasn't working. Yeah. So what does that say about, this solution? Like, I have my own thoughts on it, but obviously I want to, trust but verify. And I think the only other person in the room that agreed with me was my CISO. He's like, yeah, that's exactly why you're here. Like, we need someone thinking outside the box, because everyone else in this room is just going to blindly trust this vendor because they put, millions of dollars into this product.
Yeah, I'll tell you, the military does a good job in a few areas. And one of them, and I'll be honest, I didn't understand the need for it then because it was not very pleasant. But when you go through the gas chamber in basic training, right, we have this CS gas is tear gas, very military grade of tear gas. And to give you confidence in your mask, you have to go through this gas chamber. And so you'll go through. It's very unpleasant. They give you the mask. They tell you the mask works. I was initially comfortable trusting. I'll trust you. I don't need to go through the gas chamber for you, to trust that the gas mask works. But the reality is, for all of us to truly understand and appreciate that it works, you got to test it, and you got to test it in the worst way, which is you go in there, no mask, right? Or you go in with the mask, then you take the mask off, you breathe in, you choke, you cry, right? And then you throw the mask on and realize this works. And so it was a lot about not only training how to use it, but it was also learning to trust that it works. I think that's an important lesson in terms of security tooling today as well, right? We can trust the vendors so far, but I would encourage you, and I tell that to my clients, right? Our customers, throw everything you got at it, right? That's how you'll trust it and how we'll make sure that we're meeting your needs. So that's absolutely critical.
Yeah, that's a huge thing, that trust but verify. When you bring up the gas chamber there, it makes me remember or recall, when people were saying that that's too cruel, right? That's like too cruel for our soldiers to go through. It's like the very first time that they should experience CS gas should not be on the battlefield. They need to know, one, they're not dying.
Right.
Two, they can get through it because they did it before. Like all of these things are absolutely critical. It's same thing with, security or IT in general. Like you have to build up that resistance. You have to launch a cross-site scripting, attack yourself to understand what's actually going on. Like, when I understood what a cross-site scripting attack was, it wasn't because I read it in a book. It was because I did it and I saw like, oh, wait a minute. Like I just made this query a little bit weird and I got back, 3 accounts when I should have got back 1. Okay, now I kind of understand what's going on here. I get the function that's going on, which, I think is an interesting segue into abnormal security. So let's start with what abnormal is. What's the problem that abnormal security is trying to solve?
Yeah, so abnormal security is an AI native email security solution that uses behavioral data science to really baseline your environment and understand deviations from norm. So if you go back a little bit in history and you think about the move from antivirus to EDR, right? Instead of trying to define what evil looks like and then find it based on what we know it looks like, EDR changed flip tables. It changed the game entirely and said, what if we don't care what evil looks like? What if we just know your environment so well that when we see a process run and spawn another process, right? Microsoft Word shouldn't probably spawn another process. That would be incredibly unusual, at least certainly 10 years ago, maybe a little less so today. But still, there are certain behaviors, regardless of how evil gets into an environment, it sort of standardizes in what it needs to do next. And so that's how EDR changed the game. Well, Abnormal came along, and our founders didn't come from the email security space. They actually come from ad tech, so advertising. And they had learned a lot about machine learning and understanding behavior through machine learning algorithms, large language models. And so they were actually behavioral data scientists and started to talk to other folks in the security industry and said, what is a problem that isn't solved well today? And one thing kept coming up: email. It's 2023. At the time, it was 2018. And we're like, look, email's been around since the dawn of time in terms of the internet and networking. Why are we still talking about email security? And the reality is because nothing had really solved it completely. You think about what we used to see: malicious links, malicious attachments. Those were the kind of the bread and butter of bad guys. And the reality is today, bad guys aren't even using these tried and true methods. We've trained our users in all what worked then, but are now the wrong ways to think. We train them: don't click on any links and you'll be fine. Don't open any attachments from somebody you don't recognize and you'll be fine. Look for misspellings or bad grammar, and that's how you know you found the bad guy, right? That's a phishing email. Look, the reality is bad guys have departed from those tried and true methods in favor of more advanced attacks, right? First, it started with Grammarly long before generative AI was a thing, right? AI, ML, NLP, these things, they've all been around a good long time. But the transition into AI that generated net new content, that is a relatively new concept, right? ChatGPT was released almost a year ago today, right? November 30th, I think, 2022, kind of world changed. But even before that, they were using Grammarly to improve. And so, but now with the advent of ChatGPT and Bard and other generative AI solutions, we're seeing threat actors that couldn't formulate a coherent English sentence 2 weeks ago can now write they can craft a very good, realistic phishing message, probably better than my 10th grade English teacher, Mrs. Fox. So, and that's saying something. So that's what we're seeing is, things are leveling. Generative AI in general has leveled the playing field for bad actors.
Yeah, you bring up a very valid point, is that email security really hadn't changed in, a decade. It's kind of the same exact thing. Like, oh, this is how you train your users on email security. These are the rules that you configure. It's such an antiquated method. It would never keep up, in modern day email security.
Yeah, and so at my last job, I just had never seen a good solution to an email that simply said, "Hey, Bill, it's Bob. Give me a call when you get a minute." Because that's what we're seeing today, right? Bad actors, it starts with a conversation, right? If they can, the social engineering attempts that we're seeing today really just seek to start a conversation and carry it from there. Business email compromise is the number one, at least in terms of financial impact, the number one security threat for the last 3 or 4 years running, according to the FBI's IC3 report. So, this is what we're seeing. And so I remember thinking at my last company, I had all the right tools, had a wonderful tech stack. I'd spent 3 years building with my leadership, flipped it over entirely, had upper right quadrant stuff across the board. It was the tech stack of my dreams. And yet there were still things slipping through. And so we needed to think about things differently, right? You look at the way email security has traditionally been. You set a secure email gateway on the perimeter of your environment to protect you. That's great. It's largely looking for, again, defined evil, right? It knows malicious IPs, malicious URLs, malicious attachments. But if those things aren't present, and if DMARC, DKIM, SPF all check out, it's going to deliver that message, regardless of what it says, because it couldn't really look into the body of the message. And then I took a meeting with Abnormal's founder, and he explained, Sanjay, he explained that Abnormal is fundamentally different. Rather than trying to sit on the perimeter and guard things and evaluate them as they pass. It would sit outside as a SaaS solution, would sit outside your network entirely and make API calls directly into your email tenant, evaluate every message, including those that are that east-west traffic that nothing else could see, right? 70% of all email traffic is internal. And so feds are blind to that. And so hearing all of this, I said, okay, that's great. I mean, how long is this going to take to install? This is going to take months. I was a Fortune 500 bank. I mean, I couldn't do anything in weeks, let alone months. Setting up the infrastructure, it's going to be a nightmare. And he said, no. That's not how it works. It's all going to just take minutes. It takes 3 clicks. And because it sits outside, you don't have to change your mail flow routing. You don't have to make MX record changes, right? All you do is give it the creds and we're off and running. And I said, okay, well, we'll see. And sure enough, we did. We set it up as a POC, and I got a report the next day. And I'll never forget looking at that report thinking, wait, let me just understand. All this is slipping through my tech stack right now? And he said, yeah. And listen, we want to call your attention to one message in particular. This one here, this is your HR business partner corresponding in real time right now with a threat actor. And I went, no. Oh my gosh. And sure enough, it was that particular one was a direct deposit fraud case where they were trying to convince our HR person that one of our internal users was trying to change their direct deposit. They were on vacation. And to be fair, the threat actor had done their homework. They used the world's greatest hacking tool, LinkedIn, found someone with a high, big title and probably a lot of money, went cross-referenced that with Facebook, saw that they were posting pictures from Cabo, and realized this person's on vacation. They created a Gmail account that was the user's first name dot last name at gmail.com. It was an unusual name. And it looked very legit. And from that email, sent a note to our HR business partner and said, hey, I'm on vacation. That's why I'm emailing you for my Gmail account. I don't have access to my corporate account right now. I just realized we changed banks before we went on vacation, but this is really important. I need, we're on vacation. I need my next check to come to the right bank. Can you update my direct deposit information? And she was like, no, you didn't fill out the right form. It's attached for your convenience. And wouldn't you know it, threat actor fills it out probably better than any employee ever would. And she was getting ready to make those changes when we caught it. So needless to say, it didn't take much more to convince me we found the solution.
So, what I hear a lot of the times, everyone's using Microsoft Office, 0365, right? Everyone kind of thinks that Microsoft has this stuff, kind of locked down, that it's, not going to really get through. You can get by with their default settings. I mean, how do you break that mold? Do you break it by showing them? Because I'll tell you right now, I actually, we looked at Abnormal internally, right? And it was that exact same mentality. It was like, we already have Microsoft. Like, what are they going to provide that Microsoft isn't? And then when we talked to Microsoft and Microsoft referred Abnormal Security, and we're like, oh, wait a minute. Like, Microsoft provides similar things and they still referred us to Abnormal.
Yeah.
So like, how do you break down those boundaries?
Yeah, I think the key thing is to understand the differences, right? Microsoft, to be fair, very good, right? If you've got an E5 license and you've got all of the spam stuff turned on, they do a great job with defined evil, right? If they know that this is a known malicious IP address, a known malicious sender URL, if they can look at how recently the URL was stood up, they can do lots of things on the front end. However, where they admit, right, to their own, as they brought you guys, they told you guys to look at us, they're admitting that there are still things that they don't do well. And one of those is identifying malicious activity without a link, an attachment, without any known evil. And that's where we come in. We're using those large language models. We're using behavioral data science to baseline your entire environment. So what I mean when I say that is that, let's go back to that adage a moment ago. Hey, Bill, it's Bob. Give me a call when you get a minute, right? The things that we may know, having lived in your email environment for a while, we know that Bill actually goes by William, right? Bob knows that. And so for the first time ever, Bill calls Bob calls him Bill instead of William, even though they've been friends for a long time. They've traded thousands of email messages. He's never called him Bill. Well, that's unusual, right? And then it comes from a place that we just don't expect, right? Or the timing is off. There are certain things tonally by using by evaluating the content of the message using natural language processing, large language models. What we can do is understand, parse out the message itself, the message body, and understand what's actually being said for the first time. And so because of that, we can understand tonal changes. This isn't how Joe normally sounds. He's not this formal in his messaging normally. Something's different.
Huh. Yeah, I mean, you just answered probably like my next two questions, right? I was going to go back to that email and, ask how do you defend against it? And two, what's a large language model? Because you always hear these terms with vendors, and at some point, as a security professional, you kind of just gloss over it, right? You don't even look into it anymore. But that makes a lot of sense as to why and how Abnormal is able to kind of change the email security landscape, because you're looking at the actual context of the email, with the context being the other millions of emails that are sent within the environment.
Yeah, not only that, but because we're plugged in at that level, let's assume you're using a Microsoft 365 account for email. We also support Gmail as well if you go that route. So if you're using Google Workspace for mail. But let's assume it's Microsoft 365. Because of the way you plug in using the API, Microsoft's Graph API, what you can then see also is all of AD. So now I see everybody in your company. I know what all of their titles are. I know what the work groups are. I know whose boss is whose. And now I get the richest understanding of who you are as a person. Now, when you couple that together with all of the past emails I've ever seen you send or receive, I now have this tremendously rich understanding about who you are and how you communicate and who you do it with. So if you suddenly get a new message that purports to be from a friend, right, or maybe it's a vendor that you do business with, but something's amiss, right? They call you by the wrong name. It doesn't come from the right email address. It doesn't come from the right IP address or URL. Something's amiss. Even if so with vendor email compromise, we're starting to see vendors get compromised, their email accounts get compromised. Threat actors living in those email accounts for a while, understanding who folks do business with, and then targeting and preying on those trusted relationships from the right message, right? From the right email account. And yet we can still detect that based upon tonal changes, based upon the way the history of how you talk. So, and we've caught that before. It's very interesting.
Yeah, that's really, it's a fascinating way to look at it. It makes me wonder why no one else ever thought of that before. But I mean, I guess that's a topic for another podcast. Where do you see Abnormal going in this space in the future, right? Where do you see email security going and growing in the future? If you would have asked me, 10 years ago, if this is where email security would have gone, it wouldn't have been something that crossed my mind, right? I would say it's a good idea, but I never would have said, oh yeah, like that's where it's going.
Yeah.
So where do you think that it's going?
Yeah, I think the key is AI, right? AI is changing everything. It's changing everything on both sides of the fence, right? So in terms of threat actors, it's leveled the playing field. It's also allowed them to scale attacks in a way we never could have envisioned before. And so I think what it takes and what you're going to see, you're starting to see it now, but I think it's going to proliferate in a massive way soon, which is security solutions beginning to use AI to combat, right? Good AI to combat that bad AI. Because the reality is, as the threats scale up, our defenses need to scale up as well. Because we're seeing so much more throughput in terms of malicious activity, it's going to take different security solutions that are leveraging machine learning that can parse through thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of signals to identify that thread of abnormal to chase that down and identify that and tell you as an operator, hey, I think we have something unusual here. And it's really based on the volume of signals that we're seeing. It's too much for a human to probably unite that way. And so it's going to take artificial intelligence through machine learning algorithms that can parse all that data together, just like a SIM can aggregate and correlate data together from logs. We're going to need it upstream, though, right? In our different security solutions. You're going to need it in your email security. You're going to need it in your EDR. You're going to need it in your firewalls to be able to parse through and understand, unite all of the disparate information together to understand what's going on.
Is there any thought around potentially creating like a verified user, logo or icon, in an email? So like, let's say, I'm talking to a vendor. Mm-hmm. Both of us are abnormal security customers. So you would know if the person that's sending me the email is a real user, right? Yeah. And you could tell if I'm a real user. Is there any thoughts around, maybe adding a logo to that email saying abnormal security verified user or something like that, right? Because that would really, I feel like just from a user perspective, that adds a lot of peace of mind where it's saying like, hey, I know I'm responding to the right person in this case. Yeah. Anything like that?
We've talked about that before. Google just released that capability. It's sort of the blue, the blue check mark, if you will. If you go back to Twitter's mentality. We've looked at that concept before. The challenge with that is that that was the concept of the Sender Policy Framework, SPF, using DMARC and DKIM to verify the authenticity of the sender. So those things actually already exist. And as long as we're all good corporate citizens and you have your SPF set to fail and or reject or whatever, you shouldn't be allowed to spoof. Traditional spoofing has kind of fallen out because most companies do the right thing. They set up their DMARC, their DKIM, SPF is set to reject. So if it doesn't come from the right place, it shouldn't reach you at all in the first place. That's sort of email security 101. Now, if you fast forward, the real challenge then becomes how hard is it to compromise a cloud email account today, right? Whether it's credential stuffing using compromised creds that are found all over the place, that because users refuse to change their passwords like they should. Or they use weak passwords, or whether it's like a credential phishing attack and I've now collected your creds. Regardless, let's say I have your creds. Logging into it's already a done deal if you don't have MFA enabled, right? I can just log directly into your Office 365 account. Now, if you have MFA, I can still brute force it, right? I can still try and smash you at 3 a.m. with push after push after push, until eventually you just accept one. And now I'm in. So compromising a cloud email account by itself today is pretty trivial to do. The danger then becomes, now that I'm in as you into your account, I can send messages as you with the blue check mark or whatever would be there. So I fear that it would give a false sense of security in the circumstance of an account taken. So that's what we've got to be cautious of these days.
Yeah, that makes sense. Somehow I didn't think of that, but it definitely makes sense. Well, Mick, I really appreciate you coming on. Unfortunately, I think we're at the top of our time here. Yeah. So before I let you go, how about you tell my audience, where they can find you if they wanted to reach out, where they can find Abnormal Security if they wanted to learn more about Abnormal.
Yeah. You guys can reach me directly at Mick at abnormalsecurity.com. That'll reach me, MICK, at abnormalsecurity.com. You can also go to abnormalsecurity.com/demo if you want to see how this works, because seeing it live changes lives. I'm going to tell you that right now. And lastly, if you want to sign up for a free risk-free trial, if you want to, we can come in and do a report. You can go to abnormalsecurity.com and we'll be able to set you up there as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Mick. I really appreciate you coming on, and I hope everyone listening enjoyed this episode. See you, everyone.